Again, we appreciate that you joined us. We know that your time is important, and so is today's topic. U.S. Helicopter Safety Team Roundtable on 56 Seconds to Live. A great new educational program from the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. Before we get started, happy anniversary to our webinars. We got started just about a year ago this week, as a matter of fact. And so we wanted to let you know that you've been a huge part of our success and why we keep doing this. Total webinars, we've done 45. We've had over 7,000 live attendees. We just couldn't be happier that you take the time out of your schedule to join us each week. We've also had over 9,000 video views. That's been really impressive for us. The fact that people keep going back to look at videos even from months ago. We understand that people don't always have time to watch the webinars live. And so we're grateful that you're finding them and watching them and sharing them. Obviously, that means we've had over 16,000 people view our webinars in the past year. The two that have been the most viewed, we had the highest number of attendees for employment suggestions with jsfirm.com. That was one of our very first webinars, and that was right as the pandemic was kind of getting a stronger toehold. And people weren't really sure what was going to happen. Obviously, we've had a year, and we know that we went through quite a cycle. And so hopefully the pandemic's starting to end, and we don't have to worry quite so much about job opportunities. Highest number of video views, using virtual reality to design the future of flight. That was a presentation by some engineers at Bell, and people are still going back and watching that one. So do appreciate your attendance, do appreciate that you watch, and we could not have done this without you. That said, today's speakers, we have Bruce Webb, Director of Aviation for Airbus, Scott Tyrrell, Continued Operational Safety Specialist in Accident Investigation with the FAA, Tim Tucker, an FAA Designated Pilot Examiner, Gordon Jiroux, President and CEO of Universal Helicopters, and of course, the guy with the tie, Chris Hill, Director of Safety for HAI. We do encourage you to ask questions, as always. Easiest way to do that is the question module here in Zoom. Just submit your question. We will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. We know that this is an interesting topic, so we are going for 90 minutes today. If you are unable to stay for the full time, please come on back in if you need a break, or feel free to watch the video later on, catch up with whatever you might have missed. We may not, if we do have so many questions, we can't get to them all, we may look at trying to revisit this topic maybe later this summer. We think it's going to be a good one. Obviously, the video is, or the webinar is being recorded. The video should be available within 24 hours. We will email it to the people who have registered, and we will also make it available through our website at rotor.org/webinar. And so with that, let's see if we can get started. I'd like to introduce Scott Tyrrell from the FAA. Please join us.
And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to attend. In addition to being with the FAA, I'm also a member of the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. And the USHST is an industry government initiative to reduce the fatal accident rate in the U.S. And if we could go ahead and pull up the presentation. So this, as we've already mentioned, is unintended IMC, 56 seconds to live. Next slide, please. The U.S. Helicopter Safety Team has adopted the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee and also the CAST, Commercial Aviation Safety Team's taxonomy. And so we use the CAST-ICAO Common Taxonomy definition. So unintended IMC is the same as inadvertent IMC. And we do that so that we're able to share our data internationally. In 2009 to 2018, we looked at 104 fatal accidents, and the unintended IMC was number 3 in this Pareto chart. And those percentages on those respective bars are a cumulative percentage for each of those things. So go ahead, next slide. So in 2020, the USHST embarked on a special project related to fatal helicopter accidents that involved unintended flight into IMC conditions. The project essentially sought out to quantify the amount of time from initial entry into IMC until the fatal accident occurred. And as most of you are aware of, there's been a video out there for fixed wing that probably dates back into the early 60s, and it's called 178 Seconds to Live. So we really wanted to qualify or quantify how much time it was actually taking for pilots in these fatal accidents. So the USHST analyzed 10 years of accidents, and this accounted for approximately 15%. And as I mentioned, it was in the top 3 occurrence codes, and those are primary occurrence codes. So what I want to do is very briefly go into an example of how we actually looked at that. We pulled information from the NTSB accident, and we actually got this one from the S-76 Calabasas accident. So this was right out of the docket. So this came out of air traffic control. Next slide, please. This kind of shows you the route of flight taking off originally from Long Beach, then going down to John Wayne, and then heading up the LA Valley there. Where the cursor is, if you go down just a little bit south, that's where the pilot circled for approximately 10 minutes. So go ahead and go into the next slide, please. So what we have is the pilot actually initiated a climb at 09:44:15, and at number 5 in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, that's where the pilot advised air traffic control that he was climbing to get above the layers. And then at number 6, what we have is he reached the highest altitude in his climb. And then 7, he advised this TRACON that he was still climbing to 4,000 feet. The last data point, if you go forward a little bit, was at 9:45:36, and that was approximately 62 seconds in the total scenario. So shortly, a few seconds before number 5, all the way through to the last data point was 62 seconds. And next slide, please. And next one, please. And this identifies the last data point in this slide, and then the wreckage on that last point on the map. And as you can kind of see, a couple of the first data points had the pilot actually at 380 and 325 feet AGL. Okay, so if we go to the video, which is 56 seconds to live, that'd be great, Chris.
You're looking at the weather, and it's legal for now. But the day's forecast calls for worsening conditions that might go below limits. Your flight today is for an important new customer that needs parts delivered 50 miles away. You rush through your weather and pre-flight and realize you'll be cutting it close with the forecast. You're informed that the parts are delayed in reaching you, and the weather isn't getting any better. You hurry through your checklists, but you got this. The weather's coming in faster than you thought, But just swing around it. If you canceled every time it looked like this, you'd never fly in this region. As visibility continues to drop, something just doesn't feel right. You gotta stay clear of clouds in this airspace. Obstacle. Caution. What's the height of that new transmission tower around here? Okay, this is getting sporty, and those clouds are a lot thicker. You are way too low, and now you've just punched in. You feel paralyzed. Time is standing still. You vowed never to let this happen. You now have 56 seconds to live. You're way too low, and it's like the ground is reaching up to you. Panicked, you overcorrect. In no time, you're climbing fast. You now have 45 seconds to live. Now you feel like you're turning and tumbling all at the same time and have lost faith in your instruments. You now have 30 seconds to live. This has become a nightmare roller coaster ride. The aircraft is screaming for your attention, but a part of you is starting to let go. Everything's darker now. You think of your family one last time. I'm sorry. Can you forgive me? But they can't hear you. Because you are out of time.
All right, and if I could have the other panelists go ahead and come up on screen and unmute your microphones. So hopefully that video had an impact from a positive perspective. In 2019, unintended IMC accidents actually rose to the #1 priority occurrence. In addition, if you recall, NTSB has had 2 board meetings that included helicopter unintended IMC. And obviously, weather is involved in that. So Gordon Jiroux, can you kind of maybe talk a little bit about basic VFR or special VFR and maybe some weather resources that pilots can utilize on the ground before they pull collective?
Well, you know, it's a very touchy subject for me. And after watching that video, I'm not feeling totally comfortable. So it'll have to give me a couple minutes to catch up. But the Part 91 weather minimums, as written for helicopters, allows a pilot to slowly create an environment that he might not be able to live through. And with the daytime visibility requirement only a half mile and clear clouds, I think that is part of the problem when it comes to these inadvertent instrument penetrations. I think if we could eliminate that allowable requirement for Part 135 flights carrying passengers and Part 91 flights and even Part 61 flights to begin with, I think these situations would get better. The fact that that area that you just showed has video cams along the 101 freeway, the fact that that area is absolutely notorious for that kind of weather, there's no doubt that if you're flying through that vicinity or many other vicinities, like going from, let's use Prescott to Scottsdale, it's only 71 miles. You can get a weather briefing and they could tell you it's absolutely clear or marginal VFR the whole way. And you get 35 miles into it and all of a sudden you're in a snowstorm. Okay, and you got 2 choices, you turn around or you land. You know, in my case, I've landed. So I'm still here to talk about it. as far as the events that unfolded where you keep the flight going as opposed to terminating the flight, I have an issue with that as well. I believe that in some of these cases, if it wasn't acceptable to fly at a safe speed to see and avoid in clear clouds with only a half mile in the day, people would not make it to their death point, whereas the video says they ran out of time. Allowing someone to go special VFR and to pass a couple of airports that they could have landed at, and have to get special VFR to go through those airports to get into Class G airspace, where you ultimately kill yourself and you kill your passengers as well. That's the crux to the problem that I believe. The aeronautical decision-making that is left up to the pilot, when the pilot is able to consider a safe speed and see and avoid as a acceptable practice because it's written in the FARs, for God's sake. I mean, you're just helping the person get into a negative situation. I could expand on this and go on for another hour if you like, but that's my feeling on it.
Okay, so ultimately, I think that the conversation needs to be started, and basic weather, VFR weather minimums, and potentially even special VFR should be part of that conversation. Interesting to note that in the survival flight board meeting, NTSB Chairman Sumwalt had mentioned, he said, denial is the enemy of change. And I thought that was extremely impacting when we start talking about, if we're not willing to look at our own industry, how are we going to expect change? Well,
if I can just add a little bit, at one point, I don't know, maybe about 20 years ago, I've been doing this for about 40 years. I was so aggravated, I went and saw one of my mentors who's on the panel, Tim Tucker, and I complained about it profusely to him. And I said, what can we do about it? What can we do to get the FAA to make a change? And he said, well, you really don't have to get them to change. You can make your own minimums. That took me about 30 seconds. When I got done with him, the first thing I did was start drafting my own minimum. So in my company for the last 25 years, or 20 years, I should say, we do not allow flights under special VFR conditions outside the pattern, period. We don't allow flights at or below 1,000 feet unless you're taking off and landing. If you eliminate those two things, you eliminate a lot of potential tragedies, because the percentages of what killing people and their passengers are those exclusively. The problem with making these kind of rules is you have to enforce them, and it starts at the top, right? If you're going to have a safety management system, if you're going to have a policy, practice, and procedures, or if your SOPs are going to be totally dedicated to these things, you need to have someone enforce it besides the chief pilot or the assistant chief pilot, because we know, based on the crashes that's happened, we know that some of the people in these aircraft are the chief pilot and the assistant chief pilot. And they're the ones that are supposed to be monitoring and managing their own safety management system or their own policy, practice, and procedures. And they don't do a good job all the time, especially on these fatal crashes that we're talking about in the last year or two.
Okay. You had mentioned Tim Tucker as your mentor, and certainly that's a great resource that I think every pilot needs to have. You either need to have a resource, or a mentor, or be a mentor, and actually, for all intents and purposes, be both. And seek out people as well. If someone comes to you, that's one thing, but you need to go and actually be that mentor. So Tim, you want to kind of take us maybe on a little journey from a historical perspective on inadvertent IMC for the helicopter industry?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. During the years, the helicopter community has really been all over the map. as to what a pilot should do if they were to inadvertently fly into the clouds. I know early on in my career, we borrowed the 4 C's from the airplane world, and that's control, climb, course, and communicate. So control is you get on the instrument, you start a cross check, control the aircraft. Then you would start a climb, preferably maintain the proper course, perhaps turn away from high terrain, and then communicate, get on the radio and yell for help. The problem is with just the inherent instability with the helicopter, along with the lack of instrumentation and certainly the lack of training, currency, and especially proficiency in flight by reference to the instruments, the helicopter pilot just has a hard time getting past that first C, control. They never even get an opportunity to attempt the following C's because they can't control the helicopter. Now, there are some schools of thought that would have someone do a 180-degree turn. I know there's some civil aviation authorities around the world that actually recommend this. Problem with this is for that 180-degree turn, if you use a standard rate turn, 3 degrees per second, it's going to take you a minute to complete that turn. And during that minute, you're going to have to maintain proper attitude, airspeed, altitude. Rolling into the turn is a spatial disorientation inducing maneuver. So just making that turn for a minute is going to be difficult. Some instructors just recommend an immediate climb. But again, we got to go back to that first C we have a hard time with, controlling the helicopter to be able to climb. And lastly, there's been a school of thought, this was popular 10, 15 years ago, to actually enter an autorotation. The thinking being that the autorotative glide is a very stable form of helicopter flight, and you would break out and then come back in with power. And obviously, there's some issues with that one. I think finally the helicopter community now is realized the focus needs to be on avoidance, not getting into the clouds in the first place. Not what to do when you get in, but not getting into them in the first place. And I kind of divide this avoidance process into 3 steps or 3 stages. The first stage is that decision to take off. And this is where I think, as Gordon mentioned, personal weather minimums really come into play. Everybody should have personal weather minimums. The idea being, you're going to sit down and come up with the minimum weather you're going to fly in. So when it's Sunday night and you're trying to get home, hopefully now you've made the decision of the minimum weather. You just need to have the discipline to execute that decision. Because without those minimums, people will take the attitude of just going to give it a try, or I'm just going to go take a look. And that's that first step down this road to a disaster. Now, certainly, sometimes we take off and the weather does deteriorate. So I think a second step would be the use of Enroute decision points. Now, recently, the helicopter safety team came out with helicopter safety enhancement number 127. I think it was December of last year. And they actually use the term Enroute decision triggers. And I like that term trigger better than just a point, because it actually connotates you're going to take some action. You're going to make a decision. And I've seen a lot of different triggers that could be used. I've kind of distilled it down to just 3. First would be a location. In the planning stage, a particular point where maybe it's easy to divert to another airport. Or maybe there's a point at where the forecast weather is supposed to deteriorate. You want to make a decision before that point. Or maybe a point where the terrain becomes challenging, to make a decision before entering that challenging terrain. Second would be airspeed. And again, I've seen a lot of different airspeeds used, and the one I think is good, kind of applies across the board, is if you have to decrease your cruise speed by 30 knots, that's the trigger for you to turn around. So I think minus 30 knots is a good trigger, but not less than VY, best rate of climb speed. Best rate of climb speed is the lowest point on the power required curve. So if you were to slow less than that, you're going to start moving up the backside of the power required curve, putting yourself in a situation where more and more power is going to be required. So that wouldn't be good. And lastly, altitude. And I think 300 feet would be a minimum. If the ceiling is getting lower and lower and lower, so you're flying lower and lower and lower, when you get to a point where you're 300 feet AGL, that's the trigger to turn around. Now, the last step or stage is what I like to call land the damn helicopter. And I borrowed that from an article that Matt Zuccaro wrote a number of years ago in Rotor magazine. And Matt was amazed. He said, here we have these pilots are flying a machine that can land almost anywhere, but they don't take advantage of this unique capability. They continue to push it and end up killing themselves. So this land the damn helicopter became kind of the land and live program that HAI then started. I'd actually take that land and live slogan and I'd add a little bit to it. I'd add continue and die, because that's what's going to happen. I think some people might not land because maybe they're concerned about enforcement. I wouldn't worry about enforcement at all. There's not a civil aviation authority in the world that is going to take some enforcement action because somebody declared an emergency and landed in a bad weather situation. However, there is the possibility that all those avoidance steps don't work and you end up in the cloud. My suggestion is, if that happens, you take your hands off the controls, you put your palms together underneath your chin, because you now have 56 seconds to discuss things with your creator, maybe say goodbye to your family. I'm sure everybody could better use those 56 seconds than trying to struggle with controlling a helicopter. That's not going to happen.
Yep.
Thank you.
Well, certainly great advice, Tim. You know, when we talk about inadvertent IMC or unintended IMC, ultimately what we're really talking about is unplanned entry into IMC conditions. And unfortunately, in the helicopter world, when we look at a newly minted IFR helicopter pilot, you know, they're getting training most likely in a non-rated helicopter for instrument training. And the CFII that's training them probably has just a few more hours than them. And then most importantly, they don't have any actual instrument time, IMC time. They probably have never been in a full motion sim, so they don't have simulated instruments. So I think in and of itself, they're almost fooling themselves to think that they're going to have a success on an inadvertent IMC. Bruce Webb, if you'd unmute. Bruce just recently produced a video called Imminent IMC. Did I get that right?
Yes.
If you don't mind, Bruce, kind of talk a little bit about that, but most importantly, kind of talk about your feelings about inadvertent IMC.
All right. So thank you. And thanks to HAI for hosting this event. I think that it is a positive sign that there are so many people that are interested in attending this seminar. And, you know, perhaps it's going to take education. Education is the issue. It's not that the aircraft are not sufficiently safe or that technology doesn't exist. Largely, we have an education problem. And, you know, Tim said it best and Gordon as well. And I think Scott started with it. This must be about avoidance. This is not about how we handle the situation once we're in inadvertent IMC or once we're in the clouds. That is what I speak about during the 56-second LMS program, which will be released, I believe, in about a week, maybe 2 weeks. So a follow-on to the 56-second video is an LMS program. It's approximately a 1-hour course of instruction. I believe it's very well done. Chris Hill and others at HAI have worked very hard to deliver a product which I believe if people will participate in it with an open mind, they will gain information which will help them avoid an inadvertent IMC experience. So I'm only a little fearful when I put out the video that people may misinterpret what I have to say as a acknowledgement that you're likely ultimately to end up in this situation. And I don't believe that. I believe that as reasonable pilots, exercising reasonable judgment, we can all avoid this, the ultimate, which is to end up in the cloud. And Tim's got a lot of experience, as does Gordon. And, when these people say you're not going to survive this, I believe that the efforts by Lee Rosskopf with the FAA, Scott Tyrrell, others with U.S. Helicopter Safety Team have proven 56 seconds wasn't just drawn out of a hat. It's a value that was derived through a lot of study of a lot of accidents. And so we have to realize, we have to understand that we're not so much different. I'm no different than the pilot who was in the Calabasas accident or any of these other events. We like to believe that we're not going to make those errors, but that's simply not true. We're all capable of making an error. So what we have to do is step back, and let's even step so far back as to ab initio training. I believe, and I'm going to base this upon my experience, both as a student and as an instructor, because I did what I was taught to do, and quite honestly, it was not sufficient. And I'll give you the story. When I received flight training back in '82, what would happen was the instructor, I'd have a scheduled session on a Wednesday and on a Saturday. And let's imagine the weather was going to be marginal on Saturday. The instructor would call me up on the phone and say, "Hey, Bruce, the weather is going to be too bad on Saturday. I'll see you on Wednesday." There was never an opportunity for me to really make a weather decision. I was told if I could fly or not fly. And so I really do believe it starts that soon. As an instructor, as a CFI in this industry, I challenge you to not do that. Instead, allow the student to come to your facility. Ask them to prepare a flight plan. Ask them to determine on their own, is the weather sufficient for the flight? And then based upon what their decision is, respond to that. So let's imagine you believe the weather is insufficient for them to fly, but they come to you and they say, "Listen, I've looked at the METAR, the TAF, and I believe it's okay to fly." Then you either step back and counsel them and say, "Listen, no, I would disagree, and here's why." Or perhaps if you have the ability and it's not so bad, maybe you allow them, you get in the ship and you hover out and maybe do a couple of laps in the pattern, and you say, "Now, are you comfortable? Is this a comfortable feeling?" In other words, allow them to make a decision. We as instructors, I believe we're prescriptive too often. We tell the student what should happen. Let them make the decision. And there's an ancillary benefit to this, which I believe is equally important. And that is the student should become comfortable with making a decision which errs on the side of reasonable or safety. But ultimately, they may look back at it and say, "You know what? I could have flown." So let me give you a scenario. Let's imagine that a student is going to show up on Saturday. He's going to take a check ride with Tim. He's going to get his private pilot check ride on Saturday with Tim. And he believes that once he gets that check ride taken, he's going to take his wife, his fiance out or his girlfriend out, and he's going to propose. He's got this whole scenario built up where he's going to propose to his future fiance on the next day. How much pressure has he put on himself to pass the check ride, to take a check ride? A lot. So let's imagine, and I don't think this scenario is so far afield. So let's imagine that the person gets to the airport and the weather's a little skosh. It's okay to let them make a decision to fly or not fly. And if they choose to fly, it's probably time for you to intercede and explain to them why it's not okay to fly. But hopefully what they'll do is they'll make the good decision not to fly. And they will learn from that, because pilots, we often make decisions to go when we shouldn't go. And the reason we do that is because we are uncomfortable. We are fearful that we're going to make a decision not to go. Then the weather will improve, the birds will sing, the sun will come out, and then we're going to have, it's not really buyer's remorse, but it's a pilot decision-making remorse. We will say to ourselves, gee, if I'd only just gone, look, I missed an opportunity. But that's a learning point. We all need to learn to accept making a decision which errs on the side of safety and not fly. And then on occasion, those decisions are going to be wrong. You could have flown perhaps. We have to learn to be comfortable with that, because if we're not, we're going to continue down this path of repeatedly making the more aggressive choice, the less conservative decision, and we're going to continue to crash helicopters. And it doesn't matter who the manufacturer is. We cannot build an aircraft that takes the human out of the loop presently. So we're human. We have to examine why we behave the way we behave, and we need to put barriers in place to that. So that may be a long-winded answer, but please, I hope that you watch my video, Imminent IMC, but don't believe that I am advocating that you allow yourself to get into that situation, because I do not. You should make more conservative decisions before the flight. And as Tim pointed out, you need to have personal minimums, and you need to have an en-route decision-making point, whatever that is. And it can be something even more, Tim had several great ones. It could be that if I make a flight path adjustment, just a flight path adjustment for weather, and I make that adjustment more than 3 times, I stop flying. It could be heading, it could be altitude, it could be airspeed. But if I make a flight path adjustment, and again, I'm not advocating for any of these. I'm saying, though, that we must choose before we fly. Because if you don't make a decision before you fly what you will accept, then what you're going to have is a sliding scale. And if you say in flight, well, the weather is 502, I'm not going to let it get any worse. But now it's 402. You'll continue. You'll keep flying. You have to make a decision and commit and stick with the decision. So right. Again, okay. My 2 cents.
No, appreciate it immensely. In the 31 accidents that we actually looked at within that data set that we're able to pull some telemetry data off of, what was interesting is the altitude or the average altitude for these aircraft, AGL, was 700 feet. Gordon, can you come back online there? And do you want to talk a little bit? You need to unmute if you don't mind. A little bit about 91-119, because I think that needs to be part of the conversation or the discussion.
Yes, sir. In regards to, I just wanted to capitalize on something that Bruce said. Let me just bring this up here. I have a question for him. I wanted to add that oh, hold on. Sorry. Sorry about that. I wanted to bring up that one thing that we really didn't cover on some of these, how do I want to say, complex crashes, is the passengers. The passengers are just pawns on a chessboard. And nobody's asking them what they want to do. Hey, passenger A, B, and C, do you want to risk your life today and go out on a special VFR 135 flight? Yes, I do. Sign me up. All right, well, put him in. Let's go. But what about the other 5 or 6 people? You tell them, look, we're going into some really dodgy weather. Would you rather get in a limo and be sure to get there? Or maybe we have to stop along the way. You know what? Maybe we'll get as far as 70%, but there's a pass we might not get to. We can try, but we may have to land at an airport and call an Uber. I mean, this is a part that is totally missed, that we make decisions as pilots based on what's convenient for us. No way. We should be making decisions for what's best for our passengers. And what's best for our passengers is to get them from point A to point B alive, okay? Not what's gone on the last few years. But anyway, back to 119. The minimum safe altitude for helicopters really gets my goat, because I can name 5 people right off the top of my head that I know follow all the rules in the FARs, but now all of them are dead. And all of them killed themselves while going under the helicopter exclusion, where a helicopter can fly below 500 feet or 1,000 feet and not get violated. And as long as you don't cause any damage, any persons or property on the ground. And so I firmly believe, in my 40 years experience, that these group of gentlemen that I was very good friends with, and one way or another, I sold them helicopters and trained them and tried to keep them alive. They were all pilots for 20 plus years. They were all airplane pilots. Some of them were airline pilots, and they all killed themselves doing something which was totally legal. Now, what sense does that make? And of course, some people are going to come on and say, well, you know, we shouldn't be restricted to that, and we shouldn't be restricted to this. Well, unfortunately, if you want to go scud running, then do it in a place that you are familiar with. Do it over the ocean with some floats. Do it where you don't have a chance of killing yourself. But here's the disgusting part. When you go and just fly on that exclusion for helicopters, you kill the unsuspecting people with you. And that is what really gets my goat. And that's what we need to change. We need to start looking at who we're killing, and do we got permission to kill these people when they get in our helicopter? So that also has to change. And I know I'm going to get some text messages saying I'm out of my mind, but you know what? At this point, I'm 64 years old. I don't care. I know right from wrong. I've been doing this 40 years, and I haven't put a scratch on myself or anything else. In my company, we fly 35,000 of ab initio training hours in 1 year, and several 100,000 hours in the last 20 or 30 years. And we've been able to avoid a lot of these pitfalls by just the few changes that I suggested early on. And one of them would be minimum safe altitude.
And if you don't mind sharing, what's your company's MSA?
1,000 feet, unless you are instructed by ATC and or you're taking off or landing. And I do have a problem with that too. When I go to Long Beach Airport and they want me to do a 500-foot departure over South Redondo, if the engine quits, I'm dead. So I don't want to go South Redondo at 500 feet. Okay, I got too much to live for. So I'll hold until I can get outbound at 1,000 feet. You know, it's just things that I've learned and I've adopted over the years. You know, I like to land and live, and I like what Tim added to it, but I also like the conversation to say, I want to live. And sometimes you're asked to do things that you're probably not safe to do should the engine quit or something else come up, like the South Redondo arrival. And I know there's instances where people have to fly special VFR. I've done it myself, drying cherries or frost patrol when you're in an environment, but you're taking off and you're landing in an area that you're familiar with, that you've done a low recon on. You're only a 15, 20 feet from the ground, and it's a very doable operation. But in some instances, these minimum safe altitudes are creating good pilots, or making or allowing good pilots to make poor decisions. And that's why my stance is so strong on 91-119.
And what was your MSA at night?
Well, for myself, depends. If there's mountains around, I'm shooting for the moon. But normally 1,500 feet to 2,000 feet. Like when I'm coming back from Prescott to Scottsdale at night, I can't get high enough, you know, because I don't like to see what I can't see. But yeah, at 1,500 to 2,000 feet is what I like to do and what we demand.
All right. Well, thank you. Tim, I know in your Robinson safety course, you actually utilize an accident that a lot of people are very familiar with, and that was the wedding accident or crash in South America. Do you want to kind of elaborate on that? Thank you.
Well, it's a little difficult without the video to go by, but we've actually frozen that video in a number of different places to show screenshots of the attitude that the aircraft was in. And this aircraft goes into almost a 60-degree right bank to almost a 60-degree left bank. The nose comes up almost 20 degrees. And then at the end, you can see by the attitude indicator, the aircraft's virtually inverted. But interestingly, on that accident, the pilot told the wedding party that they had to cancel the flight. The weather was not good. But you could imagine the pressure that, in this case, the bride put on the pilot, in that the wedding party is waiting for me. This is the most important day of my life. Very similar to the scenario Bruce painted. And actually talked the pilot into changing his decision and just giving it a try. And as I say, that's the first step towards this road to disaster.
Yep. And I think that's really important to understand that the pilot is the pilot in command, in regardless of who the passenger is or what the flight requirement is. Ultimately, you know, it's better to keep the aircraft on the ground. So don't take the damn helicopter off. Bruce, with regards to, go ahead.
Well, let me comment on something Tim said. And I think that it's easy to imagine when Tim talked about the ship being in a 60-degree bank, a roll. I think many people are imagining, oh my gosh, that's indicative of him, I believe as a male pilot, being out of control at that point. I doubt it. Yeah, they were having difficulty controlling the aircraft. But I believe the pilot placed the ship in a 60-degree turn because that's what the pilot did normally. And what I mean by that is this. So when we talk about a standard rate turn at 90 knots, what is that? About 14 or 15 degree roll or bank is a standard rate turn. At 120 knots, and somebody can fact check me here, but at 120 knots, I think it's 18 degrees of roll. Okay. How many of you on this call right now, when you go fly a helicopter from point A to point B, or the last time you flew a ship, whether it was today, last week, last month, how many of you rolled beyond 15-degree bank or 18-degree bank? I say every one of you. I say that because a helicopter is a very agile vehicle, we are not accustomed, because we typically fly VFR, we've normalized a bank that is fairly aggressive. So just don't fill the chat board with all your comments, but imagine your answer to this question. If we went out to 100 pilots, if we went out to an airport somewhere and we met 100 pilots, and in a very polite, benign way, we go out and we fly, and we ask the pilot to show us a steep turn, How many degree bank do you think the pilot's going to roll into? Because, and again, I have not done this, but my belief is that if you went out and really did this experiment and asked people, I believe virtually every pilot is going to roll into at least a 45-degree bank turn. Remember, you've asked them to do a steep turn in a helicopter. I believe many are going to roll into a 60-degree turn. Some are going to roll into a 90-degree turn, and a few are going to roll beyond 90. I believe that. So we have normalized these aggressive turns. So now imagine you're in an inadvertent meteorological condition, and now you're under an enormous amount of stress. You're in a high gain condition. And if your typical turn is something, in the 30, 40, 50-degree roll, that's what you're going to do in this environment. It's going to be very difficult for you to amend your behavior and damp that turn to 15 to 20-degree turn. And so I don't think it's so unusual. In fact, and maybe this isn't the case anymore, Tim, perhaps you can fact check me, because I'm a little bit, I'm younger than you, but just not a whole hell of a lot. So I believe that the practical test standards for the ATP in a helicopter say you must do a steep turn, but that turn shall not exceed 30 degrees of bank. So if you're taking an ATP ride in a helicopter and you roll into a 31-degree bank turn, you could bust the ride. So we must learn as an industry what reasonable is. And a 45-degree roll or a 60-degree turn, IMC, yeah, that's going to end in a bad way quickly.
Okay. So the 56 seconds to live video has actually probably surpassed probably 26,000 views, and we've received numerous comments on the YouTube channel. Some people kind of recommend IFR certification for the pilots and then actual IFR aircraft. For each of you gentlemen, what are your thoughts on that? Will that solve the problem? Tim has a little bit of eagerness.
Yeah, what we have done in the helicopter world is we have bastardized instrument flying. Instrument flying is like what happens in the airplane world. You plan an instrument flight, you call and get an instrument clearance, you fly an instrument route, you shoot an instrument approach at the end. What we've done in the helicopter world is we get all this training on instruments, and then we try to stay VFR as long as we possibly can. And when we can no longer maintain VMC conditions, then we hope all these instrument skills are going to come rushing back to us, and we're going to put all this instrument proficiency to work. It isn't going to happen. It's not the way it works. If you want to be, if you think an instrument rating is going to protect you from an inadvertent IMC condition, 9 times out of 10, that's not going to be the case. If you want to exercise your instrument rating, get a clear, plan a flight, get a clearance, make an instrument departure, fly en route, and an instrument approach at the end. Don't for a second think that this instrument rating is going to help me if I inadvertently go IFR. And one of the things that's most important about flying IFR is proficiency. And just getting the rating, but not having done any instrument flying for the last X number of months is not going to help at all. So we need to be not only current, but proficient. Big difference between legally current and proficient flying instruments.
Right. Yep. I couldn't agree more, Tim. And imagine this, when we look at the conditions, an airplane pilot, a fixed wing pilot, when they're operating a helicopter or an airplane, IFR, they don't wait until the weather is so bad that they have to shoot approach to minima to go fly IFR. They fly IFR, they file and fly IFR routinely. And, I made this comment at a meeting, I don't know, it was a few years ago, and we were at a large convention, and I asked the question, how many helicopters arrived at this convention on an IFR flight plan from point A to point B? How many people came here IFR? And I bet it was very few helicopters. Let's think about an MBAA, fixed wing aircraft. How many of those aircraft arrive at MBAA come on a VFR flight plan? The same amount that came on an IFR flight plan in the helicopter world, I'm afraid. So when we look at the helicopter pilot, again, in addition to what Tim said, we're not out there flying IFR, trying to fly IFR on an IFR flight plan when it's 500-foot ceiling and 2 miles of visibility. No, we wait until it's 301 or 300.5 or some unrealistic weather. In fact, think about that. I believe it's still the case that under Part 135, not helicopter or air ambulance, just 135, you can get op specs to allow you to fly with 300.5 during the day and 300 and a mile at night. I believe that's still allowable op specs. Go look on an instrument chart in your local area and find an instrument approach which allows you to shoot the approach and break out at 300 feet. I think you're going to find few, if any. In other words, we're trying to fly helicopters VFR weather that an airplane can't fly IFR in. And yeah, the results are predictable.
And Gordon? Oh, you're muted still.
It goes back to special VFR. I mean, you know, special VFR allows you to do scud running. And if you're IFR rated in an IFR aircraft and your choice is to scud run, well, there you go. If you eliminate the scud running, well, then your other choice is to stay home or file IFR and go IFR. That's all I have to say about that.
So in October of 2020, the U.S. helicopter industry had 3 events, unintended IMC related. One was a declared emergency by a pilot with a successful divert with the assistance of air traffic control. The other 2 ended up being crashes. You know, the ATC live actually was available, and the local or the nearest controlled tower asked the pilot, after advising them that they had 350-foot ceilings, were they IFR rated? And the pilot says, I am, but the aircraft's not. What are your thoughts on that, gentlemen?
Well, you know, as I just said, IFR rated doesn't mean a whole lot to me. So I would not have given him any more benefit of the doubt because he's IFR rated. And if he's flying an aircraft that's not certified, I suspect he's not IFR proficient. He should stay away from the clouds as well as anyone else should.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I think when we look at the data, and again, I'm certainly not not even close to the caliber of a Lee Roscott, but when we look at the data and the effort he put into to glean to determine that 56 seconds was the nominal time that a pilot survives in this environment, I don't believe it mattered whether they were flying an instrument capable helicopter or whether they were instrument rated. I think the data would support exactly what Tim said. It doesn't really matter. I believe that's what the data showed.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to note is, and if we just kind of look at the numbers at a 75-25, 25% of the pilots are private pilots with no additional ratings. 75% of the accidents, the pilot has a rating higher than private. In addition, 25% of the industry fatal accidents is personal private. So that means that, you know, we're looking at more advanced programs with SMS and, you know, those types of programs where you have surveillance on you. And, you know, that's 75% of the organizations with these fatal accidents. It was kind of interesting. One of the comments on the 56 seconds to live said, don't find your limits by accident.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we're seeing that as the case. We're approaching the 1 hour time frame. And what I'd like to do is bring in Chris Hill and maybe field some questions from the audience out there.
Well, thanks, Scott. Thanks, gentlemen. Great job today so far addressing a very contentious issue by some people's point of view. Certainly, we all feel very passionate about it. We're tired of watching our colleagues make poor decisions and go down the path for not only themselves, but their customers, and the industry gets a black eye every time this happens, and the loss of life is inexcusable. So thanks for sharing your passion and being a part of this program. I'd like to just let everybody know who is listening in today. There have been some questions asked. Is this course available for wings credit? Unfortunately, because this team that's here before you today stepped into the breach at the last minute to backfill a previously scheduled webinar, we were unable to gather up the time frame needed to get that credit. But that's not a bad thing, because you are going to get an advanced course here with these folks today, and you'll be better prepared to take the the 56 Seconds to Live course, that it will be going live here within the next week, as Bruce mentioned, maybe 2 at the most. We're going to get the test version of that course delivered to us tomorrow. Everyone you see on, just about everyone you see on the screen, and many others, I'd say several dozen people have participated in the development, planning, execution, and preparation of that course. And we hope you will agree that it is equally professionally developed and delivered as this video was. Very briefly, just to describe the course itself, it's not a traditional course in the sense that it's going to be, you know, a long slog through lots of interactive information and sharing and lots of grueling tests for you that some of you might be expecting. This is an entry-level snapshot to get you a few good ideas, best practices that have worked for other people, get them in your tool bag and let you proceed further and get you further down the road to making some other smart decisions, get additional training, get more information. I'd like to draw your attention to the USHST website here in a moment, where we can talk about all the other resources that are there right now. We released an article in Rotor Daily today that describes some of what is on the website now, inviting you to attend this webinar that you are attending right now. Thank you. And then some of the additional products through the course. And then I'll go ahead and kick it right to Scott to just give us a little teaser about what we have in the wings waiting for us soon with regard to simulation devices and scenario development, that sort of thing.
Yes, we're working with Precision Flight Control out of Sacramento, California. They have a VR little FTD that we've been working with them, and we actually are going to have one fielded in Fort Worth at Helicopter Institute, and then also at Embry-Riddle in Prescott. So once we get those up and running and we start utilizing HSC 123, what we'll be doing is reaching out to the local community to bring pilots in so that they have an opportunity to experience any of the scenarios that we would have, whether it be loss of control in flight, unintended IMC, or low altitude. In addition, what we're going to do is we're going to have those devices in the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team booth at HELI-EXPO 2022 in Dallas, Texas. So look forward to that.
Excellent. So just for everybody's attention, there have been some references to HSEs. So in the USHST vernacular, HSE stands for Helicopter Safety Enhancement. And if you go to the main page of the USHST and you click on that, you will see one option on the main menu that you can go to HSCE details, more info. And then this is the best evidence I could give you, even though it's not the most exciting and flashy page. This lets you know that USHST is very active. A lot of the work that's been going on over the past several years is coming to fruition. And what you're seeing on this page is the outputs and some of the products that have been developed during the course of each one of these projects that are underway. You heard a mention of HSC 123 just now by Scott. So if you click on that, you can look at some of the output products they're developing there. There was a mention of HSC 127 Alpha, spatial disorientation, that was referenced previously as well. And there have been some questions in the audience, viewers today, about stabilization systems, SAS, and autopilot. We could give you a long dissertation, and we can talk about that here in a moment, gentlemen. But if you'd like to hear what the team put together on that about loss of control mitigation through stabilization and autopilot, you can get a taste of that. Also, you can go to the USHST's website, click on the videos, check all hands webinars, and you will also see previous discussions on lots of these helicopter safety enhancements. So with that, let's go ahead and go into some questions and answers that the audience has been giving us today. Lots of activity, lots of good information, positive comments coming in from a lot of different people. So let's talk about stabilization here. Let's go ahead and I'll give this to Tim Tucker, because you've been working with Robinson Helicopter Company for some time, and stabilization is not something that's inherently you think of when you think of a small Robinson helicopter. But let's talk about some of the enhancements that Robinsons have, and light helicopters in general as the subject of this HSE, and any concerns that you might have about complacency as it relates to over-reliance on automation as people are flying in some questionable weather?
Well, at Robinson, we're just starting to expand our experience with stabilization systems. We first started with one in the R66, and we now have a 2-axis one, soon to be a 3-axis one in the R44. And this will be the first time in the industry that small helicopters, certainly small piston powered helicopters, are going to be able to be outfitted with some kind of stability augmentation system. And the price, I wish I could say it's getting less and less, but it's not near as expensive as it used to be. I think probably ours runs around $60,000, which would include the Garmin GPS that goes with it. So you're going to see more and more of these stability augmentation systems in smaller helicopters. And I think the challenge is how do we make it so these are a beneficial tool and not turn into a crutch for people? And then that's going to be the current challenge, I think, upcoming.
All right, thanks, Tim. Let's pull on the string a little bit more. Let me kick it over to you, Bruce. Mark asked a question. Helicopter pilots appear reluctant to use onboard autopilots when flying in marginal VFR, that sort of conditions. What do you think drives this decision in your mind? And again, let me just ask you to pile on a little bit about any concerns you might have as it relates to the benefits and the downside of automation.
All right. So it's fascinating, Mark. I don't know Mark, but he probably has a lot of experience in this. We do see people who will, we see it in the simulator. So we'll put people in progressively deteriorating weather. And it's fascinating because they may be coupled up 3 or 4 axes. And if they ultimately don't choose to climb into the clouds, just to, abandon VFR, and really it's not even so much commit to the instruments at this time, it's commit to the autopilot because you're coupled up. The ship is being flown by a computer system. So I believe what happens when they get very low near the surface, the autopilot will not allow the aircraft to maneuver as quickly as they desire. I'll go back to that 60-degree roll or the 45-degree roll. Many of these autopilots or automatic flight control systems are limited to perhaps 30 degrees of roll. So they may slew in a heading change and the ship's making the heading change, but it's not changing heading as aggressively as they may desire or as aggressively as they're used to. So they decouple and hand fly. Again, it's a fascinating human behavior. I believe some of that as well is linked to the fact that, and Tim is going to learn so much about this over the next 12, 18, 24 months. As we have automation, we must use it even when we don't need it to be comfortable with it and feel secure and confident in it. If you have a 2-axis autopilot system on board a VFR helicopter, or maybe even a 3-axis, but a 2-axis system, pitch and roll, and you're not using it in normal flight, if you then find yourself in a situation where you do need to use it to save your life, and your senses are telling you something different than the flight control system is commanding the helicopter to do, you're going to have difficulty with that. In fact, you might decouple and override it. So I believe we must use these systems and be comfortable with them and have confidence in them, not just when we need them, but all times. But as Tim said, that brings us back to we need to then as well maintain competency with our physical hand flying skills. So there's no free lunch in any of this. I believe that we must be careful that when someone installs or purchases a helicopter that's not an IFR ship, or even if it is an IFR ship, if they now believe that because they have that automatic flight control system, they can delve deeper into bad weather because they have this automation to save them, that's wrong. Do not do that. If you're going to fly IFR, plan, file, fly IFR. It's fantastic. but don't go traipsing off VFR believing, well, if I get my butt in a crack, I can just, I'll just use my autopilot to save me. It will save you potentially, likely. But if you're counting on that, there's just a whole plethora of problems you're opening up, and we're going to continue with fatal accidents. So I'm all about technology. Technology is fantastic, but technology is simply a tool. We're humans, and we have to have the training, education, and knowledge to properly use the tool. If we don't have all three of those, it isn't going to help us a whole lot.
Hey, Bruce, if I can add in, I've had the unfortunate opportunity to launch on several accidents, unintended IMC, and they had fully capable IFR ships. Some of them were actually even on IFR flight planes. And ultimately, what they didn't have was that systems knowledge and that integration of how to use the system in an emergency procedure. And that's really what unintended IMC is. It is an emergency. And I just wanted to offer that. So, you can have the system, but if you don't have knowledge of the switches and what effects it's going to happen and what the, flight characteristics that you need to be when engaging it, whether it's speed, altitude, attitude, or not altitude, but attitude, that's extremely important. So,
right. You have to be comfortable and confident 100% of the time that when you do X, the result is going to happen. And what happens again in these events, these unintended events, you're under an inordinate amount of pressure. And quite honestly, your capacity to make good decisions is diminished. When you're flying a helicopter and something goes wrong, the place to troubleshoot is on the ground. Don't be blasting through space at 120 knots, 150 knots, trying to troubleshoot something. Land the helicopter. When you're in a condition where you're in marginal weather or something that you didn't expect, stop. And some people will criticize and say, well, no, Bruce, if we did that every time, we'll never get anything done. Well, while I understand, like many people on this call, I've been in this business my whole life, 38 years, 39 years, and I understand the pressure and the need to make money. But I also know the cost of an accident. And really, you may have noticed many people on this call are not calling them accidents, we're calling them crashes, because accident implies there was no, that it just happened through happenstance. Most of these didn't happen through happenstance. There was a poor decision made, and the person drove forward to fruition with that poor decision to their ultimate demise. And as Gordon pointed out, unfortunately, that person made a bad decision, but other people had to live with that decision, or in this case, not live with that decision.
Since you mentioned Gordon, I'm going to put him in the crosshairs now.
That's okay. I'd like to make one point first regarding the autopilot or the SAS. I'd have to say that one thing I would bring up is Robinson made their systems really, really simple. I mean, it is so easy to learn and easy to operate. And they have this little button on the cyclic where if you just put your aircraft in a turn and you hold that button for more than 2 seconds, you can let go and it'll memorize the position and take you completely out of what you shouldn't have got yourself into. So I did want to bring that up for people that might shy away from a system like that. These are simple and very easy to operate, and they do a great job. I picked up my first R66 with the system in it, and I picked it up with my chief pilot, and there was about 30 knots of wind over the Santa Monica mountain range. And we got about 1,000 feet above the Santa Monica mountain range. And we put the aircraft in a 360-degree turn to see how it would react going from the leeward side to the windward side and go all the way around and around. And every time we were about to put an input in, the aircraft was starting to do it when we were going to do it. And I was very impressed, and I wanted the public to know that there are simple systems out there that do a good job.
All right. Thanks for that, Gordon. So
no worries.
Because you guys all answered the same question, we're really running low on time and lots of questions. So we're going to shift to lightning round. So I'm going to ask each of you just to answer, one of you to answer each question and give time for our listeners or watchers to get more questions in. So Gordon, you already have the floor. I'm going to give it back to you really quickly. And we're going to talk about, this is from Luca Carrasco Filippo. Welcome to all our international viewers out there, if that's where you're calling in from. For Gordon, how do you manage to ensure SOP compliance when it comes to weather minimums? You mentioned lots of those weather minimums that you imply. After all, it's not something for FDM, which I think you can pull the string on that one, for instance. How can a company keep an eye on their pilots? So what sort of systems do you have in place technology-wise and then cultural and procedural-wise to address that?
Great, excellent. I know it's going to be hard to believe, but we dispatch every flight every day. And the instructors have to bring their plan, their proposal to a director or assistant chief pilot or a chief pilot, and that person has to get an authorization to depart. And it's cumbersome, it takes time, but once you set it up that way, and it becomes the standard of your company policies, practices, and procedures, it's easy. The other thing we do real quick is, since most of our instructors start out as our students, they're already completely familiar with our policy, practice, and procedures before they become instructors. So that helps.
All right, thanks, Gordon. I appreciate the quick answer and lots of information within it. So let's shift over to, I'm going to try Tim on this one here. So you've been working with Robinson Helicopters since the #2 Robinson went off of the production line back in the day. We won't even say how long ago that was. I think they had a torch for a landing light on the aircraft back then, probably. Anyway, had to get that one in. So Mike Becker, one of our loyal members from Australia, he mentions the fact that a lot of our HII members, if not all of them, are ICAO compliant with their training programs, and in their commercial pilot's license, private pilot license, they require at least 5 hours or 10 hours, respectively, private or commercial, of basic instrument training. What's being taught in those schools, and what do you think needs to be taught in the future in programs like Robinson, where you have predominantly VFR training going on? What can we do there?
Well, first of all, I think at Robinson, we don't do training on a general basis. We just have our safety course. We allow our dealers and flight schools to do the training. But currently, for the commercial pilot, there is a 5-hour requirement to fly by reference to the instruments. So you have to have 5 hours experience. Up until now, or shortly, there was never any tests at all. You just had to get the experience. But come on, 5 hours of training in hood is not going to help anything at all with regard to flying by reference to the instruments. And it's more of an eye-opening to show maybe how difficult flight by reference to the instrument is, but that's all. It's not really going to help in any substantial way for someone who they were to inadvertently go into a cloud at all.
All right, thank you for that. Ava Schubat asked, what MSA would you recommend for mountain operations for VFR? In the course, we recommend folks apply the HAA weather minimums. That's a pretty extensive. But any one of, let's go back to you, Bruce. What do you recommend on that one? If it's not the HAA minimums, do you recommend something more conservative?
Well, again, for me, it depends upon the aircraft you're flying and the area you're flying in. Flying VFR across the mountains or IFR across the mountains is a big difference. So the HAI minimums are reasonable. I think as long as you have something that you believe is reasonable and you're willing to stick to. I don't think we have such a problem. I think if you identify someone and say, tell me what your personal minimums are, I think most people will tell you something. But do they follow them? That's the question. So it's not so much a matter of stating what your minimums are, it's a matter of abiding by them. And I think that's where as humans, we often miss the mark.
Right. Thanks for that. And I was referring to the helicopter air ambulance minimums in
Mhm.
135-609 VFR ceiling and visibility for Class G airspace, for those of you who want to look that up. But we will keep moving along because we have lots of material to cover here. Let's go to Paul Brewley, or Brewley, apologies for the pronunciation, of New Zealand, I believe. What avoidance and set personal minimas is a preference? Would increase simulation training requirements support recovery? And also Claude Bouchard, Tim, one of your longtime colleagues, and several others, would training in simulator be a minimum? So just kind of what are your thoughts? And I guess I'll throw it right back to you, Bruce, so you can get an opportunity to plug your double IMC training that you have in partnership with a insurance provider there, USAIG.
All right. Well, the training we provide, we certainly do examine the recovery techniques, but the intention of the program is to avoid. It's avoid, avoid, avoid. We provide information so you can make more informed decisions. But yeah, make no mistake, our goal is not to, with a couple of hours in a simulator and a day or two of ground school, to make you instrument competent. And even if you were, imagine you were, we could magically do that. What about in 3 weeks or in 6 weeks? So IFR, and Tim pointed this out earlier, it is a skill that we must continually maintain. It's not something you can obtain, put it on the shelf, and then pull it out just when you need it. So simulators are fantastic for this, but they have limitations like anything does. But if you can get into anything that will help you understand the difficulty of hand flying a helicopter IFR, and then you really use that knowledge to avoid placing yourself into that situation, that's what will save your life. If through strictly training to handle the emergency physically in the ship, let's just imagine for a moment that we could improve the level of safety, the level of success by 100% through training. That's pretty fantastic, 100% improvement. We might save 10 lives a year. In other words, if everyone is dying, but a few people are living, but we get 100% more to live, that's still a small number. What we need to do is get 100% more people to make good decisions before they depart in that weather, and or use Enroute decision-making points, or just land the damn helicopter.
Yeah. Well, guys, we're getting ready to wind it down pretty quickly here. It's clear, Scott, that you're going to have a lot of good conversation to follow up on in some of your subsequent training course development that you're going to be working on. Would you take a moment to describe what you have planned and what you had planned for a rotor safety challenge at HAI HELI-EXPO, and what are you going to set up as an alternative to that solution in the coming year leading up to the next HELI-EXPO?
Well, certainly when HELI-EXPO 2021 was canceled, that kind of threw a loop. But obviously, the unintended consequences of COVID-19 has been we now have webinars. We're doing this one, which is kind of like a little bit of our roundtable that we had thought about. But we're preparing a course for the Rotor Safety Challenge at HELI-EXPO 2021 or 22 in Dallas. And in addition to that, we're going to record that so that way we can post it to the internet so that pilots can see it regardless of, if they attend HELI-EXPO or not. But then most importantly, we are going to expand this roundtable to include a discussion with pilot perspectives, whether it's personal private, a 135 operator, and those people that have had inadvertent IMC events. And what I believe it's very important to actually get that firsthand perspective. I know that when we've been doing the auto rotations reality exposed, it's extremely helpful to get that pilot perspective. And I would be failing the FAA if I didn't mention that the FAA Accidents Lessons Learned website, we actually have 2 unintended IMC events in that library already. So I would recommend that you just go to that website. You can Google FAA Accidents Lessons Learned, and you can read those accident reports and how the FAA looked at it. And we will be having an additional unintended IMC event probably coming this fall as well. So
All right, thanks for that, Scott. And thank you very much. For those of you unaware, Scott, this was his vision to try to create a rotorcraft equivalent to the 178 seconds to live fixed wing video. And he brought that to the USHST. Nick Mayhew's listening in, the industry co-chair, and I'm not sure if Wayne Fry's with us. So everybody jumped right on board, supported the idea. And Randy Gwenda from Frasca International's with us today listening. Thank you very much, Randy, for providing his simulation support. Bruce Webb for his support on site at Airbus down there for the filming. So many more other people involved that takes too long to mention. For those of you who have not gone to the USHST's website specifically for the 56 seconds to live, I just draw your attention to that very briefly. There's several resources here available that you can go to. We've made that easy to get some of the more relevant links that are scattered in other locations on the site. And then you can see a link right here that will be activated in the incoming week, if not two, hopefully closer to a week time frame, where you'll be able to go to this course, get an hour of wings credit, and see what all the work was applied to provide you more than just a single video to scare everybody, but more about what are the alternatives there that you all can take. So we're winding up. I'll just give Tim, I'm just going to kick it to you real quick, and then back to Bruce and Gordon very briefly. One thing only that you want people to remember from this particular webinar today before they go out on their flights, what would it be? Tim, you go first.
Okay, first of all, hello, Paul in New Zealand. Say hello to Andy for me, and hello, Claude. I just have one word: avoidance, with a capital A.
All right, thank you. And then Bruce.
Yep, identical. Avoid, avoid, avoid.
All right, and thank you very much. And then Gordon, right to you. Oh, mute button. All right, you're back with us.
Don't go.
Very well. Thank you very much, Scott. Thanks again for all of this. I'm going to ask all of you to stick around and be ready for the next Rotor Safety Challenge webinar. I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I just want to give you my sincere thanks. Thanks to all the people who contributed to this event and all of you viewers today. I apologize. We only scratched the surface on your questions. We will capture those questions. I'm going to turn it over to Dan Sweet to come and join me on screen, and then I'll be signing off along with the rest of the panelists today. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Bruce, Tim, Scott, and Gordon, thank you so much for your time today. This, as Chris said, we have a ton of questions that are still out there. Obviously, this is a topic that really hits close to home for a lot of the pilots. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We are very grateful.
Thank you for hosting.
Indeed.
Thank you for listening.
I will wrap up a few things here real quick. Next week, save the date. We have another executive briefing. We had one with Airbus a week or so ago. Next week, we have Leonardo joining us. Bill Hunt will sit down with Jim Viola for a great discussion on all the great things that Leonardo are doing. They've got a new training facility. They've got the new Navy trainer. And so I think there's going to be that and a couple of other topics they're going to want to talk about. Really looking forward to hearing that discussion. There we go. And we do have a follow-up questionnaire coming to you shortly. As I said, this is our 1-year anniversary. So obviously we're getting input from the viewers like you who tell us what you want to see, what you want to hear, what webinars you'd like us to address. We do pay attention to those, obviously. Please take a few minutes and respond to that. And as always, if you have any thoughts or concerns about what HAI could do better for the industry or do better for you as a member, please let us know that too. The best way to address that is through president@rotor.org. Send him an email. Jim does see all those responses that come in, and he does pass those along to the staff for action. And that's it for this week. We do ask that you be safe, that you fly safe, and we will see you next week.